Right, so summer school always hands out evaluation forms, and that's for their own monitoring. But I just thought of this last night, and it was too late to even print out. And that is just to get an idea of what courses you might be interested in, and by that I mean, of course, relating to birds. And so I've got a list here of some possible ideas, and I'm just going to pass it around. If I was more organized, I would have thought of this a few days ago and printed a sheet out for everyone. So you can just put a tick, and you can put as many as you like. You can put none. If you want, you can add ideas around here. So there's no rush. Just pass it back by the end of the lecture. So you can mull over it for a while before passing it on. So it'll be helpful to know what kind of topics people would be interested in attending. Right, I'm going to start the last lecture in this series, and we are now reaching the present day in this long journey from Linnaeus onwards. Just very briefly, so what happens if you want to describe a new bird species? Well, first you have to go into the deep jungles of Africa or Asia or somewhere, or deserts or any other habitat. You have to have your rifle or mist net to catch birds, and then there's all the skinning and preparation, labeling, packing in boxes, and then the long transport back by rail or ship to some museum where it can be archived. And then you have to study all the books to see if this is a new species or not, as well as the specimens that are already in the museum, to make sure it's not just a variation of some other species. And then, of course, if you discover that you do have a new species, you have to think of a name. And you can't just give it any name. There are rules. There's a body called the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, and it's a team of people scattered across the world, and they periodically update the rules. They also make rulings on interesting cases. A lot of their work is actually more for historic species where there have been conflicts or someone gets new information about a bird. Hi Barry, I've just started, so come on in. Okay. But anyway, there's certainly, because nowadays there aren't really conflicts generally. There shouldn't be. Scientists know how to name a bird or animal or plant, but there are all these strict rules that you have to abide by. And of course you can name the bird after a place, a person, but I mean it's not a rule, but it's considered very not a good idea to name it after yourself. Plumage or other features, habits of the bird, also anything like that. There are also rules in terms of at least one genus has to match the family name, and all sorts of things like that. I won't go into all the details, even just under this principle of what there is. And then there's the principle of priority, one of the most important rules, but again, it doesn't apply so much it does to some extent, but today if you describe a new species, you know that you have to check that it's not been described. You can't use a name that's been used before and things like that. But in the centuries before, there weren't these rules. And so people just named things, and then as they studied the different groups of similar species, they put some together as one species or subspecies. And so it's a lot. There's been a lot of work in going back in time and deciding which name is actually the correct one for a species. And so that's where the principle of priority is really important. It was only established in 1842. So all the birds and animals from 1758, Linnaeus, up to that point, so nearly 100 years, is where the most work has been done on changing names or deciding which one is valid and so on. Right, so what names have people used? Let's talk about the scientific name for the weaver birds. And plumage is definitely one of the most important. I'll give you the stats at the end of a few slides. So yellow or golden has been used really many times for many species. This is just 6 examples, but it's a lot more than this. So just for instance, and there's all sorts of variations. So you can see Xanthopterus is Greek for yellow-winged, basically, and here yellow-legged, very unusual and rare weaver. I'll talk more about that later. So they're flavipes, Latin. So you can use Greek or Latin to make up a scientific name. If you use a person's name, you have to Latinize it and things like that. So here, golden foot. Subaureus means underneath. It's golden on the underparts. And Xanthops, Greek for yellow face or eye, but referring to the eye in this particular case. And Vitellinus, a deep yellow tinged red. That's because it's got a bit of orange tinge over there. And Hypophanxus, underneath golden again. So a lot of these birds have got the same meaning. I mean, these two, for instance, golden or yellow underneath, but by using Latin or Greek, you come up with a different name, and you can have different parts of the bird named. So there's lots of choice for naming different birds. Then another colour that's very prominent in the weavers is red or chestnut or rusty. So cardinalus, named after the cardinal in the clergy or Roman Catholic Church who wore red robes. Rubra just means red, and rubriceps means red head, and auxiliaris means the armpit or the shoulder of the wing. So it's just referring to that. It's not saying it's red, but it's obviously because there's this red-coloured patch. And here, rufous tail over here, and chestnut-coloured, this badius. So even though these birds look quite different, they've all got a bit of red somewhere, or chestnut, and there are many more. And then black is the third colour that's really predominant in the weaver birds. Niger just means black, and here black belly for this bird, and black neck because of the throat patch there in the male. Black head, but again Greek rather than I don't know if there was one here. Black belly, and Nigerimus, very black. So that's the colours, and there are a few others as well. For instance, orange weaver, or Orantius, is the Latin or Greek for orange, and a few other references to different colours, but mostly it's red, black, and yellow. Then, where a bird was collected or occurs, has often been used to describe the Latin name. Capensis for these two species, so that's from the Cape, basically. Ibadensis, this is a town in Nigeria, and this Malimbi was described in the 1900s, fairly recently, and got a very restricted range in the forests around this town. Katanga is a province in DRC where this bird occurs, although it also extends a bit into Zambia. Princeps is Principe Island in the Gulf of Guinea, and Sanctotomi refers to the island, not the saint, Sao Tome. So it comes from there. Right, and then often birds are named after people. So this guy, Sir Frederick Jackson, he was the governor of Uganda for a while. He wrote a book on the birds of East Africa, really well-known ornithologist in those parts. And he had the good fortune to have two birds named after him. So Jackson's widow and golden-backed weaver. It also used to be called Jackson's golden-backed weaver. Both of those are named specifically after him. So not his wife, uncle, aunt, or anything, but named after him. Also more recently described weaver, Gola Malimbi, but named after the person who first discovered it, who was not an ornithologist, but he found this bird and took specimens. And then Bertram's weaver from Malawi was named after Bertrand Sclater, so that's different to the author I mentioned yesterday, William Sclater, but related in some way. Huyglin's masked weaver, named after von Huyglin, who explored East Africa and collected lots of birds, wrote lots of papers and books and described birds, different bird species as well. And then golden palm weaver, named after this Austrian guy who first collected this species. So it's quite a few weavers and birds have been named after people. And then another common one is to use native names or traditions or culture. So Sakalava weaver in Madagascar is named after a tribe called the Sakalava group in Madagascar. And then there are two birds here where the name comes from the Tamil, which is a group of people living in Sri Lanka. So Nelly Corby's weaver in Madagascar, even though it's far away, it doesn't occur at all in Sri Lanka, but somehow the person who described it was Scapoli, an Italian. He just decided that he liked that name, I guess. And here the streaked weaver, which does occur in India and Sri Lanka, and Manya is just the local name for a weaver-like bird. Then the white-browed sparrow weaver, it was described by Andrew Smith, as I mentioned on Tuesday, and he chose this name Mahali, but he never really explained in his diary or in his scientific writings why he chose that name, but we know that it's very similar to this word Mogali, which is a Tswana word for a brave or fierce person. And so we just imagine that it's the scolding of the bird. You know, they're very noisy, chattery type, in a way friendly, I think, but definitely the sound carries, and it's very a distinctive sound in the savannah where it occurs. And so we just imagine that Andrew Smith chose the word for this Tswana word. He certainly wrote lots about the different tribes that he met while he was traveling through South Africa. He was interested in the languages of the local people, and so it's no stretch at all to make this assumption. And there's no other possibility, really, that's obvious what that could have come from. And then birds are often named because of their habits. So sociable weaver, socius, simply means sociable. They always live in community in these massive nests. They live in the nests all year round. They're never too far away from the nests. I mean, you may come to a nest and there are no birds seemingly, but they'll be foraging within a kilometre or so. I don't think they ever go more than 2 or 3 kilometres from their nest. And then these two bishop birds, both named after their diet. So red bishop after rice or barley, that's what these words mean. Interestingly enough, these bishops are very similar, but there are some differences. So the forehead here is red, and here it's black, and also here the vent is black, and here it's paler brownish colour. It's not very obvious in this photo. Right, so a quick summary. So this is how many weavers have been named after or fit into this category. So appearance or colour, 55 of the 117 species. So that's nearly half. And these numbers here were provided by someone else for globally all bird species, a very rough estimate because it depends on how many species you consider are valid and so on. But so the weavers actually match the global proportion sort of fairly closely. I didn't calculate the actual percentages, but it's kind of like that order of magnitude. Names after a person, 22, again fairly similar. These aren't percentages, but 117 is not far from 100, so it'll be close to that. Locality, 11 weavers were named after that, 4 after native names, and 3 habits, and then other is just a variety of different ways of naming weavers. So birds are very colourful, and I haven't seen any numbers like this for reptiles or mammals or anything, but I wouldn't be surprised if the proportion of other animals named after appearance or color would be a bit lower than this because birds are so bright and colorful. I mean, even lizards and reptiles and things would be named after appearance features, but I think probably to a lesser extent than birds. Right, and then finally you've decided on a name for your new species that you've hypothetically collected or discovered. Now you have to publish. And you can publish your type description in any journal, book, or newspaper, although nowadays people certainly wouldn't use a newspaper. That would be frowned on. But it cannot be a private publication. You can't write it up in your notebook and expect other people to take that as a valid description. Nowadays especially, it's required to deposit a specimen in a museum. And of course, even in the old days, that's what people were doing. They were collecting specimens, but some of them have become lost. But nevertheless, the type description still is valid. But as far as possible, there needs to be a specimen that's linked to your type description. If there's a single type specimen, it's called a holotype. If there's a whole series, now often people would collect, 5 or 6 of a species, and then base the description on that. So it just provides a bit more information if you see a bit of the variation in the species. So that's more valuable, but it doesn't really matter from a taxonomic point of view. Right, and then there's information that you have to include, like the type locality, the date, and things like that, although that's not as strict as the naming rules. All right, so what is the absolutely most recently described weaver? And it's this strange Fody. It's a bit of a cheat, and I'll explain that in a moment. It was published in this book, so not in a journal paper, by Anthony Cheek and Julian Hume. They wrote this book, Lost Land of the Dodo, a really extensively researched book on Mauritius, the wildlife of Mauritius, historically and today, the conservation, everything about the plants and animals and birds. Really amazing book. And in this book, they presented this painting. It's of what's an extinct bird. And it had been mentioned previously in old writings, but never formally described. And so they decided in this book, 2008, that it was time to actually give it a name and formally describe it. But it had first been mentioned by this French traveller to Mauritius, Gabriel Delon, and it was also mentioned by a few years later by Dubois, but all the travellers after that did not mention it, and so it presumably went extinct soon after 1672. So this is, of course, long before Linnaeus in 1758 started the formal process of describing species. But these guys both provided really good descriptions. They described what the birds looked like, their habits, they were tame, they'd come to people and try and look for food, just like many of the Fodies on the other islands living today are also like that. It's amazing. In the Seychelles, I've visited a few times, in the Seychelles Fodies, the research station where I was staying, you have breakfast outside because it's so hot, and they come and hop on the table right around you looking for scraps of food. And that's exactly what was described for this species. So they didn't provide a name, they just said it's this little red bird with a female being brownish and so on. And the interesting thing is to compare that to the dodo, which of course also occurred on Mauritius. And the earliest record of dodo was much earlier by the early Dutch sailors, and of course it's a very conspicuous bird. They quickly realized that this bird is very tasty and good for eating. And the last accepted sighting there is a bit of controversy about the date, but so that's a little bit before the Fody went extinct. But it's the same kind of time period. The reasons, however, are very different. I mean, the dodo was most certainly hunted for food, and that being the cause for its extinction, whereas this new Fody species, newly described. It was most likely because of black rats that were introduced to the island. We can't say that for sure, but it's just looking at all the possible factors, this is the most likely reason. Rats, so the nests, they build in low bushes, and it's very easily accessible to rats who would come in and eat the eggs and chicks. And so the birds would just not have any breeding success at all. There's one other extinct Fody, or rather presumed extinct. It was described or illustrated by Daubenton, and based on a specimen that came from Mauritius as well, but it was, I'm not sure if it did come from Mauritius, maybe Madagascar, but it looked different to the Madagascar Fody because it was more orange. But that's now considered not to be a valid species. So even though Linnaeus even included it in his book, I didn't mention it earlier just because it's now considered not to be a valid species. And even today, you get every now and then yellowish, flavistic or orange Madagascar Fodies. I haven't seen one myself, so this is not my photo, although I've seen the normal plumage quite often. Now, unfortunately, Mauritius, Rodrigues, and Reunion have had a terrible history in terms of extinctions. And you can see the birds listed here for each of the islands. And here's this unnamed Fody species. This was published before 2008. So now, of course, if someone lists this, knowing that Cheek and Hume have described it, given it a name, they would put Foudia deloni over here. I guess I must double check this because, no, this one, I remember now, apologies for that, is actually referring to the Daubenton's Fody because the other one definitely was from Mauritius. They're referring, and this one was from Reunion, now I remember. And it's considered extinct, and they just say unnamed Fody, but there actually is a name, Foudia bruante, but that's just an error on this author's part. But the interesting thing here is that there are these long lists of extinctions, and it's just because of these small islands having been well colonized early on with lots of rats, goats, and other animals causing this loss of wildlife. And Madagascar is a lot larger, so it was a bit more protected, just in that birds could be far from people. And Seychelles just had a different history of colonization, and Aldabra very remote, and so on, so the birds there fared a bit better. There have been extinctions from all the Indian Ocean islands, but only 0 or 1 or 2 species. So some islands, of course, are so small, there would have been no extinctions, and you only get seabirds on them anyway. But these 3 islands, unfortunately, have had a rough time. Since then, the conservation efforts here are incredible. So birds like the Mauritius kestrel and other species nearly became extinct as well. They were nearly added to these lists, but fortunately, conservation efforts saved them, and those numbers are increasing. Right, so just to illustrate, so this is where this extinct Fody occurred on Mauritius, and this is just a variation of all these different Fody species. This is from a paper on the genetics showing that they all are distinct species, and I'll come to that a bit later. Right, so then other than this deloni Fody, which is extinct, the most recently described weaver is the Kelembero weaver. And not that long ago, in 1990, there was a doctor working in this town in south-central Tanzania, and he saw this weaver that he thought looked very different. He was just casually interested in birds, but he had a bird book, and he thought, well, this weaver looks very strange. And he contacted Neil and Elizabeth Baker, who are doing a bird atlas in Tanzania. So they're traveling all over the country and looking for birds, keeping bird lists, and they produce these online maps. It's still an ongoing project, but they keep saying they're hoping to publish soon. Unfortunately, Neil's wife, Elizabeth, passed away at the end of last year, but he's still carrying on with this work. So when Eric contacted Neil, he rushed off to this town that's somewhere over here and saw the birds very easily. He mist-netted them and ringed some of them, and some he euthanized to send to England as specimens, and he wrote up the paper. Now, so here you can see where it actually occurs in Tanzania. The amazing thing is that it's such a range-restricted species, and it's been described so recently, and yet since then, thousands of birders have gone to see it because it's so easy to see. Once you know exactly where it is, anyone can just go to this town, Ifakara, and there's a ferry at a small village nearby, which is where you can actually, in the reeds, see these birds. You can see them nesting at the right time of year, and so one would think that it should have been discovered decades or centuries ago, but it's just that no one went to this tiny little spot where they occur. So it just means there's hope to actually find new species, and it is happening, as I mentioned the other day, especially with scops owls and things on the Asian islands and things like that. So a little bit's known and been studied, but mostly people are just going to get a photo and tick it off on their list and move on to the next bird. But still, anyone can very easily go and see and study it. Interestingly enough, there's another weaver bird, now being referred to as a Ruvu weaver. It was described by Hartlaub already in 1891 from the coast of Tanzania, and very soon afterwards, people just said, no, this is actually a yellow weaver or eastern golden weaver. And, but Neil Baker is saying that maybe it is a valid species after all. And so he asked me to delve into the literature because he didn't have it all available. And so I compiled this list. It was described. I'll just go through this very quickly. Different authors initially said, yes, it's a separate species, but there were very few specimens, and not everyone in Europe had access to them. And so gradually people started saying, oh, maybe it's actually not a distinct species. And so in summary, Sclater and subsequent authors simply said it's a synonym and not a new species. So it was a gradual transition in what people thought about it, mainly because most of them hadn't actually seen the specimens. The other thing is that one of the key features is the eye color, and in specimens you can't see the eye color, unfortunately. But so even though it had been described as a separate species, even to this day it's not considered a valid species. It would have to be written up again. So it's still considered a synonym of the eastern golden weaver, which has two subspecies. In South Africa it's just yellow, and in East Africa it's got this orange face. And so you can see, if you think about it, actually it's maybe not either of these species, and that's what people like Neil are saying. And he's collected some blood. He caught some birds. He didn't take a specimen, just took some blood, and but he hasn't yet published it. And so the Tanzanian guys, they found nests. They've been taking photos and everything, and I keep bugging Neil, so when are you going to publish this and actually write it up? And he's just so busy atlasing that he hasn't managed to get round to it. In fact, there's also a cesticular from the same area where the Kilombero weaver occurs that he believes is a new species, and he hasn't written it up yet. It is? Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes, it would. And so, as I say, he's taken the blood, but he's got problems with exporting it to a lab in Europe. And this is politics. The Wildlife Service in Tanzania wants a few $1,000 US to give him a permit to export it. And crazy. It is ridiculous. And so because you can't export it, there's no lab in Tanzania that can analyze the DNA. But I think he may, this is confidential, switch the video off. I think he has actually just sent it off anyway, but he's hesitant in publishing it. But someone's going to do it eventually. So I know the guy is working on the phylogeny of weavers, and they want to include this.
But
so
not just this particular instance. You cited so many times during the week of
yeah.
Well, this may be this, and that may, is it a different species?
Yes. The reason is just simply that it's difficult to get DNA from every single species. It's not so easy for these remote birds. I mean, you have to go and catch it, or you could shoot it, but then you have to take the blood fairly quickly. But nowadays, for rare species, you wouldn't get a permit to shoot it. So you would have to catch it and take blood. Taking blood's no problem because you can let the bird go unharmed, and the bird is fine. Yes, it's more difficult to analyze, but you certainly can. But it's actually easier to take blood than to snip a feather off. Or not easier, it's not easier, but it's better for the bird. But either way, it's fine. And I'll come to that in a moment, but it's a very good question, and we can discuss it some more as well. Right, I want to talk briefly about two other weavers that have been described. Here you can see 1916 and the other one a bit later. So this is the yellow-legged weaver, a very strange weaver, very rare, and people have claimed some sightings in 1986, but as you can see, it's in DRC, hard to get to area, and between being described in 1916 by James Chapin and 1986, there were just no records. Also, nothing is known about its breeding habits, the nest, eggs, totally unknown. And so Adrian Craig, a few years ago, said he did a really nice analysis and said that, well, actually, it could be a hybrid between Vallot's black weaver and Maxwell's black weaver, both of which occur in this area where it occurs. And the same applies to the golden-naped weaver collected in 1920. Again, very rare, very few records, very range-restricted. There have been a few more sightings, but also not that many more. It's a bit more distinctive with this yellow collar on the back, very distinctive species. Estimates, but of course we've no idea, are that there are less than 1,000 birds. But again, Adrian Craig looked at yellow-mantled weaver and Vallot's black weaver, and you can see if you mix these two, you could get this as a hybrid, and they occur in those areas. So it's very possible that these are not valid weaver species on their own, and people are starting to think maybe Adrian's right. But then these original specimens are available in a museum in Belgium, where a lot of the DRC specimens are. And Michel Louet actually did DNA sampling of the feathers and said that at the conference, he for the first time presented the results, that these actually are real species. They are not hybrids. So that's quite exciting in a way, but we still need people to go out there and study these birds and learn more about them before they become extinct. Another interesting bird I had mentioned before, Clark's weaver, was collected on the Kenyan coast in the Arabuku forest, and hundreds, if not thousands, of birders have gone out to see this and other special birds, the Sokoke pipit, the Sokoke scops owl. There's a whole list of really fantastic birds just in this Arabuku forest. I think Barry and Sue have been there or close to there, and I've been there. And Clark's weaver is fairly easy to see. It's not guaranteed. I unfortunately missed it on my visit to the forest, but most birders do see it. They feed in flocks in the treetops, and it can be noisy if a flock passes by. But it's only in 2013 that the nests were found for the first time. So even though there have been all these birders looking for the bird to tick it off and so on, but the strange thing is that they nest in reeds and not in the forest. So they move away from the forest, And these photos were taken in the Dakacha savanna, which woodlands, which is 80, 90 kilometers away. So they also are suspected to breed in wetlands closer by, but they're just inaccessible land that no one's explored. So they breed in these colonies. These are the birds and nests here, a bit hard to see. You can see a male and a female carrying food for the chicks. And in the following year, 2014, they found another breeding colony at a different place, but in the same general area. And I'm not sure if they're still looking, because now the nest has been found and described. So that was published very recently. So, and the interesting thing is the thick-billed weaver actually has a similar pattern. In winter, it only lives in forests, tops feeding on fruit, although in suburban areas you now get them in gardens as well, and then they breed in reeds. So as far as we know now, there are only two species that are forest-loving species, but that actually breed in reeds rather than in the forest, the Clark's weaver and the thick-billed weaver. All right, so this is coming to answer your question a little bit. In the early days, of course, people could only use the plumage, the skeleton, muscles, just what you could see on the bird to decide where it fits in. Is it a species on its own? How closely related is it to other species? But nowadays, we've got DNA. And just to illustrate what DNA can show us, it's always been traditionally assumed that the black and red bishops are one group, closely related, that the yellow and black bishops are closely related in a group, and that the long-tailed widows form a different group. They're all in one genus, but they're these subgroups or subgenera. And DNA, where all the widow birds were caught and blood was obtained and DNA analysis done, showed that there's one exception. So you've got the yellow bishops forming a group. So this is called a phylogenetic tree. You look at the DNA and how similar it is, and the more similar species will fall together. So the black and yellow bishops are all over here. The long-tailed widows are all here. The red and black bishops are all here, with one exception. The red-collared widow actually is closely related to the red bishop, Zanzibar bishop, etc. So what it means is it's not a widow bird genetically, it's a red bishop with a long tail. So genetics sometimes upsets things a little bit, but of course it confirms all the rest of the species being in the subgroups that we had thought. So it's really amazing what one can do with genetics, but the difficulty is in obtaining samples for every bird. Some groups are common, so it's easy. For the bishops and widows, it was possible over a few years to get blood samples from every single species. For the rest of the weavers, I don't know if it's ever going to happen, maybe. But especially, yes, it is possible to take feathers from museum specimens, but there are limitations in the accuracy sometimes. Depends on the quality of the feathers. But also the techniques are getting better and better. So it definitely wasn't possible a few years ago, but it could well be possible in the future that all birds are studied like this. There's a cost factor as well. It is expensive. So every single sample costs money. But I think things are going that way. So it probably will happen that all birds are eventually sequenced for DNA. Nevertheless, yesterday I mentioned, so this Handbook of Birds of the World lists 117 species, and but shortly followed, so that was 2010 for the weavers, the whole range for the whole series, where a whole bunch of new weavers were listed, gone up to 124. So, and that's based on a guy, Tobias, and he developed a new taxonomic scoring system for every single, and he applied it to every single bird in the world. So what he did was he had a whole set of categories. So it goes down a bit further, but it's biometrics, the acoustics, the voice, the plumage, and a few other factors that were listed. And he took every taxon, so species and subspecies, and he applied scores. And if the scores were more different from one subspecies to a different by a factor of, I think, 4 or something, he'd say they should actually be 2 species. If it only varied by 1 or 2 points, then it's 1 species. Could be different subspecies, and so this was possible. It took him quite a few months to do this, going through 10,000 birds, actually with a subspecies. It's probably 20,000 taxa that he had to go through and apply scores. But the great thing is that it wasn't expensive except in terms of time, and he was able to do it and apply it in a very consistent way. So in the past, someone would say, oh, here's a new bishop and it's a bit more red, so it's a new species. And it would be very arbitrary the extent to which people decided on what's a new species, and even in later, all these books I mentioned yesterday, rearranging the species and lumping and splitting, it's very much an individualistic thing. An author thinks, from my experience, I think these 2 birds are the same or they're not, and so on. So the one great thing is that it's a very consistent method applied to everything. It has, however, been also criticized in that it's not using DNA. And there might be things like the red-collared widow that's actually a bishop. That's a minor thing, and we know it's a different species, but it's the same principle that he may have some serious mistakes in some of the cases. And so that's why people generally aren't accepting this system yet, but it's a great tool for just looking at what is possible and pointing out the way where we should be looking. And so that's really a useful exercise. So there are a few new weaver species that he mentioned in these checklists, and I'll just go through them briefly just to illustrate. So in fact, the red-collared widow is one of them. In East Africa, this species has got red on top of the head, whereas in most of Africa, it's just got the red collar. So that's a species we know down here in South Africa. And he has split this into 2 species. So the East Africans can now tick a different species if they want to. Then in the Comores, you've got this Comoro Fody, or sometimes called red-headed Fody, and you can see that, so here Tobias split this one because it's got slightly less red in the male, and also the voice seems to be a bit different. There hasn't been a detailed analysis, but there are certainly differences in the calls of these birds to these 3 islands. There have always been 4 subspecies, so these are different subspecies, but they are still more similar in call and plumage to each other than that one. Also, the Aldabra Fody for many years was considered part of this group, but genetics has shown that it's definitely not. So I mentioned earlier there was a genetic study of all the Fodies, but again with DNA, the tricky part is what characters do you look for? And that's a very important factor. So you may use the mitochondrial DNA, or you may use the nuclear DNA or something, and using different parts mean different things and tell you different things. So you may actually in a study think that 2 birds are closely related, but if you look at something else, it's going to give you a slightly different answer. Never going to be a big difference, but it can be significantly enough different to be a different species. And so the thing to do, actually, I just forgot to say this earlier, is to look at the whole genome, the complete DNA, not just parts of it. And that is very expensive. But there was an amazing study within, I think, the last 2 years, where a massive collaboration, and I didn't read this up in preparation, so I'm just talking by memory, Americans and Japanese or Chinese scientists, maybe some Europeans, it was like 20 co-authors, and they chose a few species to do the complete genome on. And they used that to interpret all sorts of things. Absolutely amazing paper, several papers that they published in top journals like Nature and others. So really amazing, but very expensive. So to do the whole genome will give us the complete answer in terms of our interpretation. I mean, there's still assumptions made on how the DNA has evolved and changed over millennia, but as best as we can. But it's very expensive to do the whole genome. Certainly by doing a part of the DNA, you get a good answer already, but it may not always be the correct answer. Right, then this is a bit more confusing, but hopefully I can explain it well. This is the black-necked weaver, and it's always been considered, or mostly been considered, one species, even though there's this plumage variation, but because the calls are the same between these two groups. There's not much overlap in their distribution, so these are in Central and East Africa, and these in West Africa. But the confusing thing is that it's always been a separate species because of its voice, very distinctive trilling call that you can see in the sonogram here. So it looks very similar, but the calls of these two species are very different. So it's easy to tell apart. But now Tobias has said that even this should be separated, the olive-napped weaver should be separated from this. So that's that species. Then the Katanga masked weaver and Upemba masked weaver, they're very similar, occur close together over here in Zambia and DRC. And the differences are still actually quite small, but there are lots of small differences. So the beak length is much longer in this species, and then it's not so obvious here, but Tobias said that, you know, the streaking and lots of different plumage features are slightly different. So just managed to get the score to separate them. But in the end, we'll have to look at DNA to know for sure if they're the same species or not. Then the chestnut and black weaver, and sorry, I forgot to put in the other name, Vallot's black weaver. It's always been remarkable how different the plumage is, but the habits are fairly similar. But authors have noted, so when they were first described, they were described as two separate species. Then along came James Chapin in the early 1930s and said, no, the habits are too similar, should be the same species. They often build their nests with village weaver nests in the colonies. They kind of like hiding in between the village weavers. But a person, Crook, who studied the behavior of weavers, said that actually there is a small difference in how far the wing is expanded during its display. So many weavers hang from the nest and flap their wings very quickly to attract a female. And he did some video analysis and saw that actually this one has a much faster wing beat than that one. So based on that and this color difference, Tobias says they actually should be split again as it had originally been. So that I can believe is probably genetics is going to confirm that. Then the red-headed weaver is also interesting. Again, I mean, they were described as separate species initially when people found them. There's, of course, that thing of anyone who's collecting birds in the early days and sees a slight difference, it would be better to say, wow, this is a new species, than not. So there was a tendency to always describe a new species. And, of course, now in some cases it's going to be confirmed that it actually was correct, in other cases not. So the red-headed weaver now being split into three. So the southern red-headed weaver just down here. The East African race would now be called northern red-headed weaver, West Africa and East Africa. The male's got a black mask, but also very distinctively there are red edges to the primary feathers, and that's in the male and female, whereas here it's yellow. And then there's this Juba weaver, which is completely red, found in this very small area in Somaliland. And unfortunately, Somaliland is not a safe place to go, and just about nothing is known about this taxon. We guess that it's very similar to the others from the little that is known, but here the habits and nests are all fairly similar, so it's just mainly the plumage is so different that the scoring turns out that they're different species. So that has been the journey this week of the history of finding all these different weavers, from the very first one, the black-winged bishop described by Linnaeus with a whole bunch of others, all the way through to all sorts of others, up to the Kilombero weaver. I won't include the extinct Fody here. And yet, there are all these, 7 possible new species. I think the world is waiting for genetic tests to actually confirm. Some of them are probably going to be shown to be new species, others not, but there's still lots to do, both weavers and birds globally. Of course, just as a quick side note, birds are so well known, and yet there'll still be so many changes as they're being studied. Never mind insects and other small creatures. I mean, it's just like such a long way to go. New species, totally new species being described every single year. There are just too few people working on those groups to really know how many species there still are going to be. Right, so I'm happy to take questions, but first just a reminder, please do mark, I think it's down here, and it will be passed along, just ideas for future courses, what you might be interested in listening to, and feel free to add topics at the bottom as well. If you don't want to add anything or tick anything, that's fine, but for those who'd like to do that, please do so. Yeah, and any final questions? Yes?
So going to the question of English names, this is obviously a thing that a lot of birders are unhappy about.
Yes.
As an example, I was brought up with the various, knowing about various eagles, that became black eagles.
Yes.
And now they're back to various eagles.
I know.
So who's controlling the English names? Is there any control over them?
Yes.
Are we just going to continue to get this
Yeah.
perpetual changing of
Yes.
English names?
It's absolutely crazy. I have been collecting the names of weavers from when it was first given an English name all the way to now. It's not complete, but I've done lots already. And as you say, it's amazing how often, and the slide I showed yesterday, I think, where Shelley had English names where some weavers have never had and the same with birds. There are some birds that have never had a name change. It would be interesting to analyze it, and I think it's probably those that have very small populations, because there's no chance, if there's a bird occurs throughout Africa, in East Africa they're going to call it one thing, down here they're going to call it something else. But if, like Aldabra Fody, I mean, it's been considered part of red-headed Fody, but that taxon's never been called anything except Aldabra Fody, because it's one island. I mean, there's no reason to have evolved or for someone to have come up with a different name. But other names, it's interesting to look at Austin Roberts and other writers over the decades where names have been something, changed, and gone back to that. So it is really crazy. There hasn't been an international body to regulate this until recent years. There is now the International Ornithological Committee that is looking at English names specifically and trying to standardize it. So that's been going for about 10 years or so. The problem is that there's so they get input from people, but and they're trying to look at the whole, all of the birds. So in Europe, you've got a thick knee, and so South Africa, they'll say, oh, dikkop, that's like too colloquial. A thick knee is sort of like been known in Europe forever, and so we're going to call all of them thick knees. So I think there are advantages for having English names standardized, and there are disadvantages, and I don't know, I don't have too great a feeling about it now. I think I used to be more passionate about the name changes, but because I travel a lot, I realize the value of having one standard English name. Of course, a lot of people will say, but the Latin name is standard, and that's true, but the average birder doesn't want to learn Latin names. There are some who do want to because they enjoy it. So it's tricky. I mean, I visited Senegal many, many years ago, and I had a field guide where it said it's red bishop. And I saw a red bishop. I saw, it's a different subspecies, but it's a red bishop. And only years later I realized, no, that's the northern red bishop. So if the book had only told me that it's not the same as the South African one, I would have realized it then already. Of course, now I've studied the weavers since then so well that I'm very familiar with all the names and differences and things. I wouldn't make that mistake with the weavers, but I'll still make that mistake with other bird groups. It's like, gee, if I go to East Africa and I see a cesticular or something, like I won't have a clue if it's the same one as one in South Africa without going and studying up the Latin name and things like that. So as a traveler, there are advantages in having single name globally for a bird. And yet, I think at the same time, we miss out on colloquial names that we're used to, and things like that. So Bokmakiri, I think that's been kept anyway, but there are, I can't think of it now, I didn't prepare for this to answer this question, but I know that there are examples where birds' names have changed. I think that's so sad because, it's so cool to keep the local name. So I think birders must still use the names they want to use when on a local birding outing or chatting. But if you want to talk to a global birder, you're going to have to use the new name. I mean, even those change occasionally. Just so that, I don't know, people here will have different thoughts, and feel free to comment on what you think, unless there are other questions. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
If you grew up on humans and Cecil as a
Yes.
the current field guide by Roberts
Yes.
is the most frustrating book in the world because it has wonderful information.
Yes.
But if you're going to look for sunbirds, you don't have one sequence of pages on which the sunbirds are grouped. There are all sorts of groupings all over the place, and that, coupled with the fact that it's a new name, is extraordinarily frustrating.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Now, with my ringing in Cape Town, I catch a lot of the warblers a lot, and the Cape Town warblers have changed their names. So there's African marsh warbler is the old name, and for a long time I was still in my ringing book using the old names, but gradually I just kind of started using the new names. So it's African reed warbler and the lesser swamp warbler, and I can't even remember what the old name was. Sorry? Cape reed warbler, yeah. And yeah.
A bird which is widely distributed through Africa, you've got all the vernacular names as well.
Yes, but that's why they're trying to standardize it so that everyone uses one global English name. But
The vernacular languages.
oh, sorry, yes, I understand. Yes, that's true. Yes. So, I mean, this discussion is very much about English names, but you're absolutely right. And of course, I'm German, so I like to know the German names of the birds. And a Spanish visitor to Africa will want to know the Spanish names. So, yeah.
Thank you for concluding.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, Sue.
If you set a PhD thesis of what you have shown us, where do you see the most urgent research needed? What would you love to see researched if you had some control over it?
I would say the breeding biology of the rare weavers where it's not known yet. So finding the nest and eggs of yellow-legged weaver, the golden-naked weaver, and there are one or two other species, I can't remember now which, but I've got a list of them. That would be number one, just finding the eggs and nests and describing them. And in fact, for Clark's weaver, very unfortunately, the person that led the team, a wonderful person, but she did not want to disturb the weavers. So the eggs have not been described yet. Oh, we know what the nests look like. We know where they nest. We know that they're in colonies. We know lots of things, but we still don't know about the eggs. So I keep threatening to go back, but it's like a risk because if I go there, they breed those colonies that have been found. It's only 2 so far. Were around March. I could go and search and in one particular year not find any colonies, but we now at least know where to look, so I might find them. And I would certainly, barring crocodiles or something like that, go into the water and look at the eggs to take photos and describe them. But anyway, so it's that. But then also a lot of other weavers, the eggs and nests have been described, but we don't know if the species is polygynous or not. So there's lots more to study, like the black-chinned weaver. Michael Mills described the nest a few years ago, but still we don't know anything about the breeding habits of the species. So there are quite a few species where just general breeding habits. The other thing is the whole genetic component, but there are people working on that. So I wouldn't advise someone else to start that as a project. Some Americans took all the samples that they could from museums in America. So it was about half the weavers. They didn't have all the species available to them. And they wrote a paper on the phylogeny of the weavers, but they made some drastic mistakes. It was published early last year, the chief author being De Silva. And the sad thing, in the science world, this is just reality, there's still competitiveness. And they So there's a guy that I know, Staffan Andersen. He did all this work on the bishops and the widows, showing that the red-collared widow is actually a bishop. And he started expanding to the rest of the weavers. So these guys in America, they know that he has now started working on the rest of the weavers. And he contacted them and said, when he heard that they were working on this, they were just about ready to publish. He's happy to comment on the paper, to be involved, or do something. And they refused. And they said no. And they published the paper. And now we are picking up that they made basic mistakes because they don't know these birds at all. They just took the specimens, and there are some labeling mistakes on the specimens. And they are now as embarrassed as can be. But they claim to still be the first to have a phylogeny of the weavers, and it's not even complete. So I helped write a counter paper to this paper pointing out the errors.